The Teacher of Hip Hop. Lesson 17. Indie versus label. 1. Definition. Indie artist. An artist who produces, distributes, and markets music without a major label backing. May still work with independent labels or be fully do-it-yourself. Key characteristics of independent labels. 1. Financial independence. Funded through private investment, revenue from releases, grants, or artist support, not by a major label's budget. 2. Creative freedom. Artists typically have more control over their music, image, and branding compared to a major label contracts. 3. Smaller scale operations. Indie labels often have fewer staff and a more do-it-yourself approach. 4. Distribution. May use independent distributors or digital platforms. Example, Bandcamp, DistroKid, and TuneCore. Grants are non-repayable funds given by governments, organizations, or institutions to individuals or groups to support specific activities, such as creating music, touring, making videos, or starting a business. Label artist. An artist signed to a major record label or a large independent label with distribution power. 2. Control and ownership. Factor. Creative control. For an indie artist, you have full control over your music, image, and brand. For a label, often limited, label may influence style, content, and collaborators. Another factor is master recording ownership. For an indie artist, usually retained by artists. For a label, usually owned by a label. Another factor is publishing rights. For an independent artist, often retained or self-managed. For a label, often signed over in publishing deals. 3. Funding and resources. Factor. Recording costs. For an independent artist, self-funded or via grants. For a label, funded by label. Another factor is marketing and PR. For independent artists, it's a do-it-yourself or outsource. For a label, it's in-house teams with bigger budgets. Another factor is touring support. For an indie artist, independent booking, limited budgets. For a label, backed by tour support and industry networks. 4. Distribution. Method. Digital platforms. For an indie artist, it's via services like TuneCore, DistroKid, and CD Baby. For a label, through major distribution arms. Another method, physical distribution. For an indie artist, limited or grassroots. For a label, national international reach. Another method, radio play. For an indie artist, harder to access without a plugger. For a label, priority access, easier rotation. 5. Revenue and contracts. Factor. Revenue split. For an indie artist, higher share to artists. For a label, label takes majority until recouped. Another factor, upfront advances. For an indie artist, it's rare. For a label, often included in deals but must be recouped. Finally, another factor, merch and touring revenue. For an indie artist, fully kept or split with partners. For a label, may be subject to 360. Label takes a share, may be subject to 360 deals. Label takes a share of all revenue streams. 6. Career development. Aspect. Pace. For an indie artist, slower and more organic. For a label, faster rise if promoted well. Another aspect. Networking. For an indie artist, do it yourself or indie communities. For a label, access to industry events, collabs, and media. Another aspect, longevity. For an indie artist, often more control over long-term vision. For a label, risk of being dropped if sales lag. Which path is better? Preference, creative control, or creative freedom. Go indie if you want full control over music and brand. Sign to label if you're okay with shared decision making. Another preference, ownership. Go indie if you want to keep your masters and IP. Sign to label if you're okay giving up some rights for scale. Preference, and final preference, growth style. Go indie if you prefer grassroots growth. Sign to a label if you want rapid exposure and infrastructure. Another preference, risk tolerance. Go indie if you can manage budgets and do it yourself hustle. Sign to a label if you're ready to commit to industry expectations.